皆さん、こんにちは。これより、RIETI、早稲田大学のですね、シンポジウムを開催したいと思います。私、本日の司会を務めさせていただきます、早稲田大学の宮島と申します。RIETIではですね、ファカルティフェローを務めさせていただきます。本日はですね、コーポレートコントロール &CGS under the New Capitalism ということでですね、海外から2人の研究者をお招きしですね、我々の研究会メンバー加わって、パート1の報告を行った後ですね、ラウンドテーブルを行うという点になっております。では、まず最初にですね、主催者の一方を代表いたしまして、RIETIの矢野理事長よりですね、開会のご挨拶をお願いしたいと思います。矢野先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
どうもありがとうございます、宮島先生。本日はご多分の中、私どもRIETIと早稲田大学ビジネスファイナンス研究センター、早稲田大学高等研究所との共同シンポジウムにご参加いただきまして、誠にありがとうございます。主催者を代表しまして、一言ご挨拶申し上げます。本シンポジウムは、新しい資本主義の下での企業経営権と ESG と題しまして、新たな局面に入ったコーポレートガバナンスの改革、さらには今後の課題、ESG の重要性などについて議論の中で探ってまいる予定でございます。岸田政権の新しい資本主義が掲げる分配と成長の好循環という政策理念を受け、企業の問題意識は環境問題への対応、社会課題への解決といった点に、移行を加速しているように見えます。その中で、私個人としましても、本シンポジウムは大変意義深いものと考えておりますし、楽しみにさせていただいてきております。今日は第1部では、まず、宮島秀明先生に、株式所有権構造の進化とその影響について、概観していただきます。その後、ロンドンビジネススクールのジュリアン・フランクス教授、早稲田大学の鈴木和則教授、ブリュッセル自由大学のマルコ・ベヒト教授というコーポレートガバナンス分野の著名な先生方から、日本企業のガバナンスの変化とそれに伴う株主の役割などについて、欧米の最新情報と対比しながら考察していただきます。さらに第2部では、新しい資本主義の下でのコーポレートガバナンス改革の次のフェーズと題しまして、パネリストとして年金積立管理運用行政法人投資戦略部次長の、塩村健二様、東京大学田中航教授、お二人に加わっていただき、ラウンドテーブル形式で新たに局面に入りましたコーポレートガバナンス改革の今後の課題について議論いただく予定にしております。最後ですが、本シンポジウムの開催にあたりましては、早稲田大学の宮島秀明先生、鈴木和則先生のお二人にはですね、企画に協力をいただいただけでなく、さまざまなご準備もしていただいております。改めてここで深く感謝申し上げます。本日は実は4時間にわたる長いシンポジウムですけれども、多くの示唆が寄せられるものと確信しております。以上、簡単ですけれども、私からのご挨拶させていただきます。皆様どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。ありがとうございます。失礼いたします。
矢野理事長、どうもありがとうございました。それではですね、早速、パート1に入ります。はじめにですね、お三方のですね、ご報告のですね、前提といたしましてですね、本シンポジウムの問題意識とですね、これから3つの報告をですね、聞いていただく上でのですね、背景的な事実、これをですね、10分程度ですね、ご説明したいと思います。今回のですね、シンポジウム、岸田内閣が提唱しております、新しい資本主義ということをですね、念頭に置いて企画しております。 で資本主義、自体についてですね、問題を立てるということはですね、この岸田内閣のですね、新しい、特徴で、政策の新しい特徴であるかと思いますけれども、歴史的に見ますとですね、それがどういう意思に立つのか、ちょっと考えてみたいと。で、資本主義というですね、システムに関しては、少なくともですね、ソビエトが崩壊するまでは、資本主義 VS 社会主義と、資本主義対社会主義という形で問題が立ってたわけですけれども、この体制選択の問題はですね、社会主義体制崩壊自体によって決着が形でですね、1990年代になりますとですね、それぞれの資本主義が独自のユニークな特性を持つという議論がですね、非常に有力になります。当時の言葉で言うとですね、コンピーティングモデルキャピタリズム、ね、あるいはバラエティオブキャピタリズムというのがですね、重要なですね、キーワードになりました。で、主としてですね、アングロサクソン、あるいはアングロアメリカンなですね、マーケットベースなシステムとですね、大陸、ヨーロッパ、あるいは日本のですね、関係ベース、リレーションベースなシステムのですね、違いというのに着工が当てられてですね、2つのシステムがですね、法律性の面ではですね、いずれかにですね、どちらか優位であるということではないので、2つのシステムが世界的にです、併存しているという、見方がですね、提示され、それがですね、かなり影響力を持った時代がございます。で、その頃は、日本はですね、世界経済の中でもですね、2位の地位を占めてですね、日本型システムがですね、いわば頂点に達した時期である。で、ただ、この1990年代の状況ってそういうふうに、それほど長く続きませんでですね、20世紀の後半ぐらいになりますとですね、世界的にはアメリカが復権していくこととですね、グローバル化が進展していくことによってですね、マーケットベースの仕組みに対するですね、信頼が高まっていきます。で、日本ではですね、日本型システムの持っている問題がですね、銀行危機、あるいは不良債権問題という形でですね、深刻になります。で、その結果としてですね、その結果といたしまして、20世紀のから21世紀の転換点のところではですね、コンバージなですね、システムのですね、修練がですね、大きくですね、注目されることになります。で、世界の仕組みはですね、アメリカ型の仕組みの方向にですね、修練するのではないかというですね、議論が影響力を持ち始めまして、日本でもですね、アメリカ型の仕組みへの改革が取り組まれることに。コーポレートガバナンスコードはですね、2000年代初頭には世界各国に普及いたしまして、会社法の改正も世界各国で進展するわけですが、マーケットベースの仕組みの方向に、ね、世界は大きく舵を切って、世界はもしかするとですね、米国型のシステムにですね、修練するんではないかというですね、認識を持たれたのが2000年代かと思います。で、これが大きく、転換いたしますのがですね、2008年のですね、金融危機でありまして、2008年の金融危機と、その後のですね、停滞の中でですね、アメリカ型、あるいはマーケットモデルに対する、株主市場主義に対する、批判がですね、高まりましてですね、2010年代になりますとですね、あまりに強いガバナンスがですね、社会的な不平等の拡大、あるいはですね、環境問題をもたらしているという見方がですね、強くなってきました。で、こうした動向をですね、さらに強めたのがですね、今回2020年からですね、我々見舞われたですね、COVID-19、コロナのですね、打撃であったというふうに考えます。 で、世界はですね、そういう意味でですね、2010年代に入ってから大きく潮目を変えてですね、一言で言えばですね、リスポンシブルな資本主義、ステークホルダービューの方向にですね、舵を切った側面がある。で、それに対して日本のですね、2010年からですね、最近にかけての動きはですね、異なった動きを示しております。で、日本はですね、基本的にはですね、一周遅れの状況にですね、あったというのがですね、2010年代のですね、状況であります。で、アベノミクスはですね、日本の長期停滞の要因の一つがですね、米国型のですね、仕組みへのですね、変化の遅れですね、株主の権利、利益がですね、あまりに軽視されているためにですね、成長の鈍化が起きている。で、マーケットベースな仕組みをですね、導入することによってですね、成長を加速することができるというビジョンを持ちました。で、成長戦略の一環としてですね、コーポレートガバナンス改革が提唱されて、その改革はですね、株主の利益を強める形でですね、実現されるというアイデアである。で、それに従ってですね、いろいろな一連の改革ですね、コーポレートガバナンスコードの導入、これは世界に対して10年ぐらい遅れることになる。スチュワードシップコードの導入等が進んだ。で、そうした中でですね、2010年代、終わった時点でですね、アベノミクスが何を生み出したか、それをですね、分析してみますとですね、結果としてはですね、アベノミクスが狙いとしたですね、企業行動を積極化して、投資やですね、企業効率を引き上げるという形は、という課題はですね、十分に満たされていなくて、他方でですね、配当の増加とか、自社株買いの増加、というようなですね、株主の利益に至るような改革はですね、実質的な成果を生んだという変化が。で、そういう意味でですね、アベノミクスの成果はですね、道半ばのところでですね、コロナのですね、打撃を受けたというのが日本の状況になります。で、コロナがですね、大きな影響をですね、日本経済に与える中で、日本でもですね、ESG に対する関心、あるいはESG 投資のブーム、それからですね、カーボンニュートラルの動きが加速化することになります。で、そうした背景の下でですね、岸田内閣、2021年にですね、成立した後は、これまでの株主中心、株主主権主義に代わってですね、今一度ですね、ステークホルダーのですね、立場を鮮明にすることになります。で、これまでの成長に加えてですね、分配の重視ということをですね、主張する。で、成長とですね、分配の好循環を主張するというのが岸田内閣のですね、一つの主張です。そこで、日本のコーポレートガバナンス改革の課題はですね、現在の時点ではですね、二重であるというふうに見ることがある。一つは、アベノミクスでですね、積み残した課題、コーポレートガバナンスを整備すると、株主主権的な意味でのコーポレートガバナンスを整備する。まだ残っている問題があるのでですね、これをですね、整備することと、それからですね、新たに発生した、新たに我々にとって大きな問題となったですね、社会の持続可能性に対応するようなですね、枠組みを作っていくという2つの課題を持つということに。で、そういうようなですね、形でコーポレートガバナンス改革がですね、2つの問題を持っているというふうに考えますとですね、改革の方向はですね、企業の目的、あるいはですね、会計制度の変更、それから典型的にはですね、コーポレートボード、取締役会のですね、整備をさらに進めていくというようなことが、アジェンダとして、提示されるわけですが、それと並んでですね、重要なですね、アジェンダはですね、 その2つの課題をですね、実現できるような所有構造をですね、設計し、それをですね、我が国に創出していくということになります。で、本日のですね、シンポジウムは、その課題をですね、明らかにするということでですね、3人の方々の報告をこれからですね、お聞きすることになります。で、いくつか残された時点で、時間でですね、前提的な事実を確認して、で、2つの課題を実現する、コーポレートガバナンスのですね、新たな課題として、今申し上げた2つの課題をですね、実現可能な所有構造はどういうものがですね、想定されるかということでありますが、これについてはですね、我々も研究を共同にですね、やっておりますですね、オックスフォード大学の公認名誉教授は、ここにありますようにですね、2つのですね、タイプの所有構造のコンビネーションが重要だというふうに言っています。一つはですね、ファイナンシャルなリターンをですね、最大化するような株主、そうした投資家群とですね、それからもう一つはですね、企業経営者のですね、長期経営にコミットするようなですね、株主、そうした株主、この二つがですね、併存し、結合していくということがですね、重要である。で、これらはですね、どこの国でもですね、何らかの割合でですね、結合しているわけですけれども、そのですね、適切な組み合わせというのがですね、今後の制度設計で非常に重要だということをしております。で、このうちの1ですね、企業がですね、社会的課題の実現を、利益を生み出す形で、実行していくと。その利益を生み出すという側面をですね、支える、あるいはそういうふうに聞き続けるのがですね、アウトサイドシェアホルダーであって、それはですね、現在ではアクティブファンド、あるいはですね、アクティビストファンド、アクティビストヘッジファンドに期待される割だと思います。で、それに対してですね、社会的問題の解決を支える、あるいはリスポンシブルな資本主義、責任ある資本主義を支えるという側面のですね、所有の中心はですね、ここにありますようにですね、いくつかの候補がありまして、例えば、ファミリーとか、ね、あるいは、従業員もですね、それに含められる場合が、で、さらにですね、事業法人自身がですね、そうした長期の株主になる場合もありますし、現在、影響力を高めているのはですね、インデックスファンドを中心としたパッシブ、インベスターであると思います。で、こうしたですね、枠組みの中でですね、本日はですね、それぞれのですね、所有主体のですね、現在のですね、あるいは日本、あるいは世界のですね、動向をですね、最新の研究成果としてですね、ご報告いただくということに。で、現在起きていますですね、日本の株式所有構造の変化についてですね、いくつか確認しておければと思います。で、1個目ですけれども、これはこれから後もですね、報告されますけれども、最近のですね、20年間、日本の所有構造の変化は非常に大きい。で、特に大きいのは正規転換点のところがあってですね、ここで見ます、インサイダーとアウトサイダーって書いてありますが、インサイダーはですね、長期的な株主で、事業法人とか銀行とか生命保険。で、アウトサイダーは機関投資家を指すわけですけれども、その比率が大きく変わったのは正規転換点ですが、近年はですね、それは比較的安定しているという特徴があります。で、しかしですね、こうした近年の変化、今の数値ではですね、安定しているわけですけれども、内部を見ますとですね、実質的な変化が静かに生じている。で、5つぐらい変化があるんですけれども、1つ目はですね、かつては海外機関投資家はですね、ホームバイアスということで、大規模企業しか投資しない傾向があったわけですけれども、近年になりますとですね、投資対象が中小企業群まで増加しているという変化が起きていまして、海外機関投資家はですね、中小企業の企業についてもですね、ガバナンスの担い手になりつつある。 で、2番目にですね、これは鈴木先生がご報告いたしますが、アクティブファンドがですね、増加して、現在は第2のピークを迎えている。で、第2番目の時期のですね、大きな特徴は、その存在がですね、多様化している。で、3番目はですね、事業法人の株式所有構造に大きな変化。で、少額に持ち合うようなですね、持ち合いっていうのは急速に減少しております。で、これは、企業が持っているですね、他の会社の株式の銘柄数を書いたものですけれども、この10年間でですね、確実に減少している。そういう意味で持ち合い解消してるんですけれども、ブロックホルダーと言われるですね、5% ぐらい持っている株主のですね、割合はですね、あまり変化が生じております。で、4番目の変化はですね、2000年代に入って、これはジュリアン・フランクス先生がですね、丁寧にこれからご説明いただくところでありますがですね、自社株買い急速に進展しております。で、自社株買いの規模はですね、今や新規発行を上回っておりまして、2010年代になっておりますと、この図でありますようにですね、自社株買いで資金をですね、吸収する部分の方が新規発行を大きく上回るという状態が。で、最後にですね、アウトサイダーとしてみました機関投資家の保有比率っていうのはですね、国内、海外合わせておおむね 50% ぐらいで2005、6年から安定してるんですけれども、その内部の構成がですね、アクティブファンドからインデックス、パッシブファンドにですね、変化しているというですね、特徴があります。このグラフにありますのはですね、アメリカのですね、機関投資家のパッシブとアクティブの割合で、パッシブが同じぐらいになった。で、日本市場の海外機関投資家のですね、パッシブ、アクティブの割合は明らかにすることができないんですけれども、国内機関投資家を見ますとですね、ここにありますようにですね、明らかにですね、アクティブからパッシブへの移行が進展しておりまして、この背後にはですね、日銀の ETF 買いとかですね、GPIF の積極的な日本株購入等がある。おおむねですね、こういうような事実をですね、念頭に置いていただきまして、本日はですね、これからジュリアン・フランクス先生、鈴木先生、それからマルコ・ベヒト先生のですね、ご報告に入ります。私のですね、報告は以上といたしまして、続きまして、ストックリパーチャスを中心にしてですね、ジュリアン・フランクス先生にご報告をいただければ。それではどうかよろしくお願いいたします。
Well, thank you very much, Professor Miyajima, and thank you to all those who've organized this symposium. This is my third visit to Japan, and they're always so enjoyable that I can't wait to come back for a fourth visit, the Japanese government permitting. What I would like to do is to talk about managing ownership here in Japan using share repurchases. And I would say the principal theme of this presentation is that it is the management of the company that manages not just the repurchase of shares, but their disposition, their sale of shares to specific parties. And one reason for why this is unique, I think, is that in most other markets, the market for share blocks is not managed by the management of the firm, but is managed by investors and outside block holders. I'm going to spend just a few minutes giving a background on the landscape of ownership, the types of markets of corporate control, and then I want to describe a couple of Japanese case studies where the company has repurchased shares or repurchased blocks of shares and sold them to business corporations. If you like, examples of managing, if you like, the ownership of the company by management. And then I'm going to provide more aggregate statistics on these share repurchases and, if you like, managerially managed ownership. And finally, the litmus test. How does the stock market respond to management managing the ownership of its companies? How does it respond? Does it respond negatively or positively? And you would think it might respond negatively because management might be motivated by private benefits of control. And I'm going to surprise you, but I'll keep that to the end. So this is the landscape of ownership around the world, and this is a very famous figure. And on the vertical axis, what we've done is to add up the 3 top shareholders in each stock, in each country's stock market. And I just want you to look at the horizontal line for 40%. So 40% and above 40% means that in that particular country, the top 3 shareholders, on average, own 40% or more of the outstanding stock. And that is very concentrated shareholding. And I've given you some examples of stock markets, Brazil, France, and Germany, which are relatively concentrated. That is, their top 3 shareholders are above the 40% mark. And I would say this, just looking at this figure, that the vast majority of stock markets around the world have concentrated ownership. Dispersed ownership is the exception. It is not the rule. What is so interesting is that Japan and Korea are adjacent, are close to the UK and US. On normal, conventional measures of concentration, Japan looks remarkably similar to the UK and the United States. But we know that there are important differences. And the differences are who owns the blocks of shares in these different countries. And I'm going to talk briefly about it. If you look across these 85 countries and ask the question, who are the dominant shareholders? The answer is clear. Families. Families, on average, own 45% of shares outstanding across these stock markets. Another 23% is owned by private business corporations. So on average, families and business corporations, they dominate the shareholding profile of these countries. But there are exceptions. One exception, of course, is the UK. And if you look at the red block, and look at the right-hand one, is 69%. 69% of shares outstanding are owned by, or if you like, are widely held, but with a block holder. And what do I mean by widely held with a block holder? The block holder owns more than 5%, but holds less than 20%. That is, there's no controlling shareholder, where a controlling shareholder owns 20% or more. So the large dominant block of shares are private, are dispersed shareholding, but with a block holder of greater than 5%. There are also this is the blue block, about 20% of the market where they're widely held and there is no single block holder with even 5%. So that's why Britain is described as a widely held or dispersed stock. And if you look at family ownership is small. In Japan, this figure is not very different from the UK. Look at the blue one, widely held without a block holder, quite large at 20, but quite large at 13%. Look at the red, 56%, I think it's, yes, 55%, widely held, but with a blockhold. If you look at the red and the blue in Japan, and look at the red and the blue in the UK, the sizes seem remarkably similar. There is, though, one difference. In Japan, those blockholders are often business corporations, whereas in the United Kingdom, there are institutional investors like pension funds, insurance companies, and other kinds of asset managers. So it is the ownership of the blocks that you really see the difference between the UK and US markets. So we can divide the ownership of stock markets into three groups: dispersed ownership, like the Anglo-American markets; concentrated family and state ownership, continental Europe and much of Asia; and finally Japan, which is dispersed, but with significant intercorporate blocks. As Professor Miyajima said, if you look at the red line, which is insider ownership, you see it's been declining in the last 20 years in Japan, but it's still significant. In 2017-18, it was still 30%. And if you decompose that 30%, the majority, look at the yellow line, is business corporations, and the red line are banks and insurance companies. So of that 30%, 2/3 of the blocks are held by business corporations. And that's really distinctive in Japan compared with the UK or the US. There are three types of markets for corporate control in these markets. The most familiar one is the takeover market and hedge fund activism, which is so prevalent in the United States and in the UK, and increasingly prevalent across Europe. And as Professor Miyajima said, we've certainly seen shareholder activism in Japan, and Professor Suzuki is going to talk about that in more detail later. So the first are takeover markets and hedge fund activism, particularly characteristic of dispersed shareholding markets. Then, of course, there's the market in blocks, particularly in family-controlled firms. Now, notice here where the blocks are bought and sold, they're bought and sold by the families, not necessarily by the company. So I would not call that a market managed by management. In contrast, what I'm going to describe in Japan is a purchase and sale of blocks managed by management. And that makes Japan unusual, if not unique. I want to give you a couple of case studies. First, Nintendo, which is a case of joint investment. So Nintendo bought 7% shareholding from family members, if you like, the offspring of the founder of Nintendo. And what did they do with it? They put it into treasury stock, and with 1.2%, they sold to DNA. And with the cash proceeds of this sale, they purchased a 10% stake in DNA. This was to finance a joint investment. I do want to point out that the purchase of the block, the repurchase of the block of 7%, was done through TOSNet. TOSNet is like, we describe it as a quasi-private transaction. Why quasi-private when TOSNet is organized by the Tokyo Stock Exchange? There's nothing private about that, except the window. If I own a block of 7%, I can contact the company and say, would you like to buy this block? And if they say yes, I can notify the market, let's say 24 or 36 hours before, that I'm selling this block. And of course, the company is prepared to buy it. What is the opportunity for other investors to intervene in this transaction? The answer is because of this very narrow window during which it's published, something like 24 hours, it's very difficult for other investors to intervene. And that's why we call it a quasi-private transaction. It may be part of the public capital markets, but the regulations are such that these are largely private transactions. The second case study is a particularly interesting one. It's where Suzuki, and this is extraordinary, it purchased in total 23% of its own stock, 17% from General Motors when GM was distressed, and 6% in the open market. The 17% went through Tosnet, went through this quasi-private channel. And what did Suzuki do? They placed 1.8% with other companies, but 20% they placed with Volkswagen as part of a strategic alliance. So these two examples illustrate, if you like, a theme, and a theme that I'm going to explore, which is the repurchase of blocks and its placement with other corporations, but all managed by the company itself and not by outside shareholders. Now, I do want to say that in these two cases, there are family shareholders. In one case, a small shareholding, in another case, somewhat large. But in many other cases, there are no family shareholdings. I think these two are interesting. I said 23% was very high. And you might say, well, 23% looks very high. It's particularly high because in the majority of countries, there is a regulation that you cannot repurchase more than 10% of your shares. In fact, the large majority have this. I think it's correct that the UK and the United States do not have this. Now let me give you some aggregate statistics. Of 1,700 plus companies that are listed, about a third, a little less than a third, make no share repurchases at all. But look at the number making share repurchases cumulatively of 10% or more, 399, more than 15%, 249, and more than 20%, 143. So if you like, the example of Suzuki buying a large block is not very unusual. And the mean of the blocks conditional on a company repurchasing, the mean is 9.2%, the median is lower at 5.9. But look at the 75th percentile, it's 13%. So the 75th percentile is companies there are purchasing 13% of their own shares. So these blocks are large. What happens to the shares repurchased? Some are cancelled, that's the blue line. But some are sold, and that's the yellow line. It's kind of interesting that in the last 5-6 years of this time series, the cancellations are above the disposals. And you might conjecture that that is the result of the influence of the Japanese government on the governance in Japan, an attempt to make Japanese companies maybe a little more sensitive to outside shareholders. And it may also be the influence of foreign shareholders, who now, as Professor Miyajima said, now constitute maybe a little more than 30% of the Japanese market. So this looks at annual repurchases averaged over approximately 18 years. And you see it's about 0.6%. This is the red block. Annually, it's about 0.6% of the market. In more recent years, it is above 1%. And what happens to that repurchase shares? Well, a third are cancelled. So this is on average a third are cancelled. A little more than a third are held in treasury stock. And the yellow bit is the disposals. And I want to look at these disposals in a few minutes in detail. But what I want to show you is that if I look just at the stock of treasury stock as an inventory, and I plot how much on average treasury stock is each year, you can see on average the inventory in treasury stock is rising all the time. And in 2018, 4% of the Japanese stock market was roughly held as treasury stock. Those are large numbers by any measure. Now, I'm really interested in the disposition of the treasury stock, who they're sold to and how they're sold. And you can see the composition of disposal is a third M&A, maybe a little less than a third by public offering, and somewhat more than a third by private placement. But the characteristic of private placement, look at the right-hand part of the slide. Here we look at private placements of more than 1%. And who are they sold to? The answer is clear, to business corporations. So the private placement market is dominated by value, by sales to business corporations. And it's this that is particularly interesting to us. We talk about repurchases being used to manage ownership by Japanese management. So here's a question and here's an answer. If these repurchases had not taken place, what would have been the ownership profile of the Japanese stock market? And again, using this definition of outsider ownership, in 2018, look at the red line, outsider ownership, it's actually 60%. But this is after repurchasing. Suppose these repurchases had not taken place. What would have been the effect on outside ownership? And the answer is, it would have been 70%. That is, outsider ownership is 10% less than what it would have been in the absence of share repurchases. And if you want to split up that 10% between without open market operations and without TOSNet, i.e. quasi-private transactions, that 10% is roughly 5%. So the bottom line here, if you like, the main theme here is repurchases have been used to, if you like, reduce outsider ownership and thereby increasing insider ownership. The question, of course, arises, what is the stock market response? And right at the beginning, I said the Anglo-Saxon scholar approaching this would think, I think the answer is going to be negative. Because after all, managers of companies managing their own ownership, surely this is a classic private benefit story. And Professor Tanaka has made some very insightful comments. And this is one of his early comments. You would think that the stock market response would be negative. It would be dominated, management would be motivated by private benefits, and the stock market would be negative. Let's take those repurchases, which are the result of open market operations. And let's take that proportion of open market repurchases, which is inventoried in treasury stock. And then let's assume that they were sold with a public sale. You can see we've got two events here, the repurchase, and the market likes the repurchase, that's 2.6%. And then we've got the public sale. The market doesn't like the public sale. This is a very familiar result. And the answer is add 2.6 to minus 7.48, and you get minus 4.8. Now let us assume that the repurchased stock is held in treasury and then disposed of by private placement. And what do you get? You get plus a net plus 5.76, which is the 2.6 plus the 3.15. So we're adding together, we call this round tripping. We're adding together the stock market response from the repurchase decision and the stock market response from the sale or disposition of the treasury stock. Now you might say, well, I've chosen open market operations, but what about all the others? What about TOSNet repurchases, tender offer repurchases? The pattern is remarkably similar. Where the repurchase is made by TOSNet, held in treasury, disposed of by a public sale, the answer is negative, minus 6.83. Where disposed of by private placement, it's plus 3.78. And similarly with tender offers, the pattern is the same. Always, when whatever the form of repurchase, where it's privately placed, the answer is the round tripping, the addition of the two event CAR windows is positive. Now, I do want to say Professor Suzuki wrote a paper 10 years ago or more where he showed that the response to public placements to private placements was positive. And indeed, there is a younger Suzuki, I presume no relation, who's written a book also showing the response to private placement. So ours is consistent with that. But this chart is different because we're not talking about issues from authorized share capital, which may be made for reasons of control, like M&A, but they may also be made for reasons of raising cash and financial. This chart is all about repurchased blocks and how they're sold. And what our paper shows is the motivation for the sale, at least, is largely one of a business relationship, a joint investment, a joint venture, partnership, etc. And where it is privately placed, the net effect is positive. And finally, let me conclude. Repurchases have become important in Japan. Blocks are often repurchased through TOSNet. It allows management to manage ownership. And most repurchased stock is held in treasury, placed with other companies to finance, as I said, strategic partnerships, etc. And finally, contrary to my prior expectation, the stock market response to these private placements and round tripping is one of which is positive, i.e. the market views them as value increase. Thank you very much.
どうもありがとうございました。これから10分程度質疑応答を取りたいと思います。Zoom でご参加の皆さんに対してはですね、Zoom でご参加の皆さんはですね、Q&A のですね、コマンドがあると思いますので、そこにですね、簡単にご質問を書いていただければですね、こちらの方で可能な限りですね、お答えさせていただきたいと思います。本日のですね、ご報告はですね、僕も挙手立てで加わっているわけですけれども、株式所有構造を決めるのは誰かというところから始まっているわけですね。で、アメリカ、あるいは会社法もそう想定していると思うんですが、株式所有構造は株主が決めるというのがですね、教科書的な理解であるわけですけれども、実際の世界はですね、必ずしも株式所有構造を株主が決めているわけではない。で、例えばですね、発展途上国、あるいは大陸ヨーロッパではですね、ファミリーがですね、所有構造を決めている側面がある。それに対して、日本のユニークなところは、ね、 経営者自身がですね、自分の会社の所有構造を決めてるっていう側面があるというのをですね、強調したのが、今回のですね、論文のポイントかと思います。それからもう一つはですね、そういうふうに考えると、経営者がですね、自分の会社の所有構造を決めてるとすると、それはプライベートモチベーションっていうか、プライベートベネフィットに、ね、基づいてるからですね、企業価値に対してはマイナスに作用するんではないかというふうに通常想定されるわけですけれども、それをですね、実証的に検討した結果、必ずしもそうではないと。で、一定のですね、タイプの場合は特にですね、バリューインクリーシングだと、企業価値を引き上げるというところをですね、強調したのがですね、この論文のポイントになるかと思います。それでは、ご自由にですね、質問、いただければと思いますが、フロアの皆さんいかがでしょうか。いかがですか。何か出てますか。ないです。please.
You speak in English.
Yes.
日本語で
全然構わないです。
It might be a great idea if this is possible to take your mask off while you ask this question. I don't know if you're happy to do it. If you're not happy, you shouldn't do it. But it does make it easier for me to hear you.
Absolutely. Could you hear me better?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation. That was really interesting and very easy to understand for me. And my question is the one that you talked about, how the repurchases of how it's going to be reinvested or like put into market again, or how it's used, and that the market responds positively if it's placed into private placement. I'm wondering how many lags you put in order to consider this effect, because I'm sure that the company conducts the repurchase, and then until they decide what to use those repurchases for, that's going to need a lag in order to identify the effect to the market.
I think that's a very interesting question, and I don't think I can give you the answer to that. It's a very good question. Let me clarify what I think you mean. I think you mean where the repurchase is made, and then there's an event window, and we calculate how the market responds. And sometimes that stock is held maybe for a week, maybe for a month, maybe for a year, and it's then disposed of. And we look at the event window around that disposal. But your question is, well, what happens in between? And I can't tell you what happens in between. It's a very interesting question. It's not an easy question to answer. And I'll tell you why. Because we can't necessarily tie a specific repurchase to a specific sale. Like they're pooled. But an absolutely great question, and I'll certainly think about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
いかがでしょうか。鈴木さん、出てない。時間も限られて最後に一つだけ、質問。Can I ask you? ですね。このストックリパーチャスで、ストックリパーチャスの企業の意思決定に対して、外国人投資家、あるいはヘッジファンドアクティビズムが、アクティビストがどういう関係に立っているのか。それを促進しているのか、促進してないのか。あるいは、促進しているとすればですね、それをどう解釈すべきかというのが一つのポイントになるかと思いますけど、少し補足してもらえればと思いますが、いかがでしょ
う。Do you mean what is the regulatory view?
No, what is the relation between hedge fund and active fund to the company's decision of stock repurchase? Is it promotive or not? Or if it's promotive or encouraged, then what's the reason?
Again, I don't I'm not sure I can answer the question. I would say it's TOSNet is clearly there. TOSNet clearly assists the channel of TOSNet because the window of notification is so short. You see, block sales happen everywhere in the world. Okay. They happen off the exchange. They happen in the UK, the US, etc. But they happen between buyers and sellers outside the company.
Wow.
What is so unusual here is they happen they're managed by the company. And the reason why I think this is happening in Japan, it's so easy, is because of TOSNet. TOSNet allows this very short window. Today, I notify the company, look, I want to sell you a 5% block. On Monday morning, the stock exchange announces, a block is going to be sold. You have 24 hours to kind of study this and kind of intervene. And the answer is, we see very little evidence of intervention. And that makes this very unusual. To what extent are companies complaining about this is an interesting question. And I don't know the answer. I think it's a good question. As a co-author, I think you should know the answer to that question.
Okay. Thank you. それでは、この報告の続き、午後の2番目のパートでもですね、また立ち戻りますので、ジュリアン先生のご報告はここまでということにいたしまして、次に鈴木先生に譲りたいと思います。Thank you so much for your presentation.
Hi. それではですね、2本目の論文の発表させていただきます。For the sake of our other speakers, I speak in English. Today, I'm going to discuss the activism and engagement in Japan. Activism has been referred to in this country as monoyu. Activists has been referred to in this country as monoyu kabunushi, or vocal shareholders. But there are many other ways for shareholders to try to have their voices heard by the company that they invest in. I refer to such voices heard behavior as an activism, or more broadly or generally, we should call it an engagement by an investor. In fact, shareholder activism is an important element of corporate governance in this country nowadays. This presentation is going to be split into two parts. The part one is the background. It's more like a general information about the situation, the status quo of the activism and the shareholder composition. The second part is about our research of one company which is engaging for the sake of asset managers, who is called Governance for Owners Japan. We have obtained private data of their engagement record, day to day, more like diary of their engagement record under confidential agreement, and then we have analyzed what happened. So part one is about the background. This is a brief overview of the change of shareholder composition in Japan. It's similar to the graph that Professor Franks has shown. On one hand, shareholders are becoming increasingly important in corporate governance. If you look at the composition, the yellow one is individuals, blue, non-financial corporations ownership proportion, green, financial corporations, and pink or rose in the foreigners. So for over the past years, the proportion of individuals is almost stable, but the proportion of corporate open ownership has been declining. It is now around 42%, 46% against 42% against foreigners and individual combined of 46%. So in a sense, I put these colors according to these the signal. The green is more like a safe investors, blue, green, red, a little bit dangerous, yellow, neutral. That's the kind of idea that I put the colors on. Individuals are more like can go whichever way they believe in. Foreigners tend to be rather critical about how the management is run, especially when the company is not doing well. It used to be the case that Green, the financial corporation, was a kind of supporter of shareholders, in a sense that they agreed to almost all the proposals made by the management. But recently, thanks to or because of the stewardship, whichever way you may put it, their behavior is changing, especially in the institutional investor side. Blue, I would say that they are mostly supporters still, because they are more like have a lot of business related relationships. In any way, that's the background. And then we have this activism since 2000. I have split these activities over the past 20 years into 2 decades. The first decade I call first generation of activists, started by the famous Yoshiaki Murakami, who has become the prominent activist in Japan. He started launching hostile takeover campaign in 2000, and he invested in several companies throughout until 2009, 2008. He is still active with different fund, but generally he has been the kind of creator or founder of this movement in his activism. The Murakami was followed by Still Partners, US fund, and TCI, the Children's Investor Fund, British fund, who made several kind of rather hostile bids against Japanese companies. The general characteristic of these first generation activists are that they are very public. They prefer the public campaign to pressure the company to change or accept the request that they want. And I have, when I was in the industry trying to protect the companies, my clients from Murakami, I know that he never, compared with the second generation that I'm going to explain, he really didn't explain a lot about what he wants. He just comes to you saying that you're wrong and you have to change. Okay? So there is no pre-negotiation before he starts making campaign public. The second decade starts somewhere around 2012, 2013, which is more like accommodative in a sense that you first knock at the door, try to negotiate something, your requests, and then if it doesn't go through, then he will go to the public. So this is more like a two-stage activist. First come to you to make some proposals or requests, and then if it's not accepted, then he will go to the public campaign. So I think the biggest success so far, I guess, of these activists, in a sense that it's good for the economy and stock market in general, is 2019 Olympus case, where they sent 2 external board members. The fund sent 2 external board members, and share prices skyrocketed. It's still around 3 times more than before their bid was made. That fund is called WIAS. On the other hand, there is still some turmoil caused by, in a sense, activists. especially in the case of Toshiba. They have about 20 different, I don't know whether they're all activists, but it's hedge funds invested. And then in the end, everyone requested everything, and then they couldn't decide on any of the issues. So they're trying to kick out these hedge fund activists by buying back the shares, which is now taking place at this moment. So this is about these are the summary of statistics about what happened with the activists. Especially in this case, I'm talking about the shareholder proposal. This is more like open request, sometimes in the shareholders meeting, sometimes in public campaign. They create a website, betterwhatevercompany.com, and then write all the complaints about what is wrong with that specific company. The total case in 2020 was 25. It became 21, 2021. And then this year, we received 47 companies received proposal like that. The number of outcomes, by outcome, I define as some response by the company, response to the request. I have found 10 out of these 47 plus 21 plus 25, which is about 11% acceptance rate. 8 of them are not resolution by the shareholders meeting, but voluntary change by the management. Instead of being shamed by passing the resolution, they voluntarily withdraw some of the proposal or change before it gets they receive some verdict from the shareholders meeting. If you look at the average approval rate, since the approval rate, the successful outcomes are only 11%, I have looked at the how much percentage of shareholders supported that specific issue. The average is a little bit less than 27. So most of the resolutions must at least clear the majority. So it's still far from where we are. This graph shows the activists' holdings and proposals. The proposals I've already explained. The red line represents the number of proposals, number of companies which received proposals. I have only graphed until 2020, so 47 is not there, but still it's on the increase. There was a small short period of 0 between the global financial crisis and several years later. The green line shows the potential activists possibilities. I have calculated the number of companies whose shares are owned more than 5% by any of these activists. The company's number is somewhere around 180 at this moment. So there are many potential companies which may receive publicly their proposals, or may already have been receiving some private contacts or requests behind the closed doors. These are the public activism agenda. It used to be that first generation activists concentrated on payout, dividend increase, repurchases, or privatization by management buyout. Well, basically the story is that you want your shares to be bought back more expensively than you purchase. That's the whole idea. More recently, there are increasing number of requests related to the board. Especially just like Olympus, they want to send the people related to the fund, representing the fund's view, to the board member as an external board member. Those requests are increasing in number. So with that background, we are going to focus next our research on the activities of governance for owners. The difference is that with these public activism is that they will never go public. The agenda will never be disclosed. Well, for funds, eventually you will figure out. I figured out in several cases that they are investing because they show up in the list of large shareholders, like 3%, 2%. But I haven't seen any company which was invested more than 5% so far. So in any case, so this is more like the spectrum of institutional investors. The hedge fund activist is to the right. This is mostly concentrated ownership with only 20 or companies invested per fund. And each fund manager tends to look after typically less than 5 to target the change of the market. The center, in the center is the so-called active fund. Active fund is different from the passive fund in a sense that they pick up the shares that they invest and they do not follow the index necessarily. The difference with the hedge fund is that they invest much more in number. And it is not that common that these active managers make public campaigns. So our focus is mostly on these two pillars, the active manager and hedge fund activism, the comparison between them, and how the stock market reacted to these campaigns. So part 2 of our research. This is engagement by Governance for Owners Japan versus public activism by activists. So this is mostly in terms of the shareholder returns and the probability or acceptance rate of their proposal. Our research is based on our proprietary data provided by, thanks to the cooperation of Governance for Owners Japan. They have 2 activities. One is more like an engagement service based on fixed fee, and the other one is more like a fund, co-invested by Tokyo Marine Asset Management. The comparison of return is made between these 2 functions and then with the public activism of the activist. So let me introduce a little bit about Governance for Owners Japan. Governance for Owners Japan is a joint venture between Governance for Owners, Go Investment Partners in London, and Tokyo Marine Asset Management in Japan. The proportion, shareholding proportion is 60-40. They have 2 functions. One is engagement service on behalf of institutional investors, is mainly foreign institutional investors, pension funds, sometimes passive, sometimes active. They engage on behalf of these asset owners at fixed fees. So their main function is to go to the companies, raise some issues, and then try to solve or improve those problems. They have 39 firms engaged between 2009 and 2018. That's what we obtained the data about. That's one function. The second function is JEF, Japan Engagement Fund, which is co-invested fund between Tokyo Marine Asset Management and Go Japan. Mainly, Tokyo Marine Asset Management operates the buy and the daily holding of the stock, and Governance for Owners Japan provides, in a similar way, some engagement service, knocking at the doors, trying to improve the management, and so on. But the difference is that they are, in this case, the fund is based on the performance base. So compared with the JEC or JSS, they are working for institutional investors without any control over to whom the investors will invest. In this case, they're jointly investing. So they have control over to which company they are going to invest and when to sell or exit. The common similarities, the common factor is that they never go public in terms of their engagement. They always discuss in the closed doors. So the benefit of this research is that you seldom observe what's happening behind closed doors, even for the public, these public activists. They may be discussing before they go public, but you will never see what has been discussed or how the company has been responding. So in this case, you know how they reacted and what were the agenda that were originally discussed, how long it took to make changes, and so on. So this is a summary of Go Japan engagement. Left-hand side is the service for the institutional investors, pension funds. The right-hand side is the fund. So you have cumulatively 39 against 21 firms invested or engaged throughout the years. In any year, they tend to engage with 20-ish, 22 firms because they're changing the target companies every year. Sometimes engaging with new ones, sometimes stop engaging with the existing ones. So generally, the engagement service on the left-hand side is around 20. And for the investment side, they invest mostly around 10. So the sample size is rather small, but you will see that their performance is pretty good, really good. What are the characteristics of the firms that they get engaged? For the fund service, the engagement services function, they tend to engage with large ones. If you look at the mean and median market cap at the start of the engagement, which is around 2008, that's why you have in the bottom 2008 market cap of topics top 20% statistics. So this is about 400 firms within topics. If you look at it, it's similar to some of them are definitely within those top 20 percentile. On the other hand, JEF, the fund, is concentrating on middle to small cap stocks within topics mainly. Well, not necessarily. Sometimes they invest outside topics universe to someone in the JASDAQ or the second section of the stock exchange. So relatively, the sizes are smaller. So they are investing in very different types of companies. Well, they are engaging with different types of companies. These are the summary of engagement agendas. Generally, there are a lot of things. Well, typically you have some issues about capital management or how to deal with your piling up cash, or some increase in dividends or the share repurchases and so on. Again, there are some issues on board members, especially the one thing you have to be noted is that they will never propose any specific person. Okay, that's the difference between the public activism. Public activism will nominate some to the board. But in that case, in Go Japan's case, they will not nominate some, but rather recommend the types of person they prefer to be on the board, like women, foreigners, and so on. So in any case, so the interesting difference between the fund services, the engagement service, and the fund itself is that they concentrate more on the strategy, obviously, because they want the company to outperform in terms of the real operating performance. And another interesting aspect is that they tend to request the company to be more liquid in terms of the share in the market. Sometimes they push or convince or encourage the company to upgrade to the first section of Tokyo Stock Exchange, or now called premium, which causes huge share price positive returns. We know that when you upgrade it to first section, you experience a lot of returns. So that's the strategy. They are helping or encouraging the companies how to get upgraded to the first section. So that's one interesting strategy, which we will never see in the fund engagement service, because they have no control over which company to invest. So they don't have much interest. So these are the funds target or the counterparts that they meet. They have 541 meetings over 7 years. Most of them are top management. 2/3 of the people, the meeting took place between the top management. The remaining 33% is more like middle, junior. But most of the people they see is either CEO, president, or the board near board members. So they are mostly targeting the top management. So the difference, this is the what? Now we come to the share price reaction. We observe the share price reaction because this is a private transaction, private engagement. You will not be able to have any stock price reaction until company takes reaction. I'll show you that in the case of public activism, there is already some movement in share prices when the market figures out that this activist owns a share. But in this case, they will never announce anything. So you have to wait and see until the company announces. So this is the announcement returns. In the case of engagement service, it's somewhere around 4%. In the case of the fund, it is 9% within 3 days. Within 11 days, it goes down to 4%. This is due to some reason that there is some negative stock price reaction right immediately after, before the announcement. We are checking what is happening with this, but that's the what we have got so far. But still, there is a positive return, around 4 to 5%. Well, short-term returns is not everything. So we are going to focus on the buy and hold abnormal returns over the whole investment period. That's this graph. If you look at these figures for the engagement service, it's somewhere around 20%. But for the fund, as I explained, since there are a couple of very successful cases, the average and median both 50% over the holding period, on the topics. Yes, we know that there may be some small size company effect, but even discounting on that, 60%, 50% is huge. This is the comparison table for hedge fund activism. This is a public activism. We took the return, buy and hold abnormal return, from the period of the submission of the statement of large shareholdings. The market knows that there is the 5% holding by this specific activist, until the end, which may either be that they were repurchased by that company, or M&A took place and they sold all the shares, or they gave up and sold the shares. If the shareholding becomes below 5%, they will issue the final statement that their shareholding is not anymore about 5%, and that's it. I assume that this is the last date of the investment. So if you look at it, well, it depends on whether the campaign was successful or not, but in general, the return is about 20% over the buy and hold, the whole period of holding. If you're successful in forcing the company to change or accept some of the issues, then it's higher. But the important thing is that even without any outcome, in a sense that you get resolution passed, which I show you that it's very rare, or the management didn't change anything by themselves, their return is around 15%. So that's why there are so many activists. They're profitable. But this is not the only way to get money out of these things. That's the whole thing. Okay, so let's skip a little bit. And then I'll show you the cumulative abnormal returns around outcome announcement comparison. The fund is 9.4% within 3 days. The engagement service was 2.65%. And activists' success when there is an outcome by the activists is 4.85%. But this is not the whole picture. As I explained, there is some positive returns at the time of the issuance of the statement to the to FSA, because if you are surpassing 5%, in that case you have to submit the report. There is about 4% of normal returns upon the submission that this hedge fund is now owning more than 5%. My time is running out. So conclusion is that on average, Governance for Owners Japan's quiet, not public engagement work pretty well. Outcome or success rate for agendas higher, around 50%, than that of public activists, 27%. CARs, the cumulative abnormal returns at the time of announcement, are mostly comparable, although there is some plus and minuses depending on the sample. Buy and hold abnormal returns are higher for the fund, which is 60-something%, than that of the engagement service and public activism. So that's about it. So quiet engagement can work as well or sometimes better than the public activism, but we don't really observe. We admit that there is a possibility that the activists may have engaged in this private activism, quiet activism, before they start making these campaigns. Thank you very much.
先生、どうもありがとうございました。この報告はですね、クワイアートエンゲージメントのですね、実態を明らかにしてですね、その結果を詳細に分析されてですね、パブリックアクティビズムに比べてですね、サクセスレートが高い、それから事後的な成果も高いという点をですね、実証されたかと思います。フロアの方でですね、何か質問、ございます？ジュリアン先生、マルコ先生、教書者ということですが、何かコメントとか、付け加えている点がありましたら、よろしいですか？質問はですね、どうぞ。塩村さん、どうぞ。
貴重なお話ありがとうございます。非常に洗脳ない話というか、下品な質問になってしまうんですけれども、パブリックの、アクティビティですと、そのアクションと結果自体の透明性っていうのは非常に高いと思うんですけれども、このプライベートの場合は、そこがそこを疑ってはどうしようもないと思うんですけれど、そのエンゲージメントの記録自体のその確からしさっていうところについて、疑問が生じるこ ことはあると思うんですけども、そこについては、何らかの対応とか、検討というのはされているんでしょうか。
まさにおっしゃる通りなんですけど、これもう、他の研究もすべてそうなんですが、我々がやってる今別の研究の方もですね、いわゆる非公開のデータをもらって、分析をする場合には、その会社だけしかやってないという保証がどこにもないので、そこを調べないといけないということは、理解しています。で、このケースの場合はですね、少なくとも他のアクティビストが入ってないことだけは確認しています。それがダブってるとそっちの影響だっていうふうに言われてしまうので、他のアクティビストが投資をしてないかどうかっていうことだけは確認してますけど、それ以上になるとちょっと正直言うと、彼らが一生懸命頑張ったから、結果が出たのか、なんとなく世の中の雰囲気だったのかって言われると難しい問題があると思いますけど、でも、まあ、ずっとこう、ミーティングのメモを見ていくと、だんだんと相手がこう理解をして、アクションを取るようになっていくっていう、プロセスはある程度見えるので、そんなに外れた話ではないのではないかというふうに思っています。ご指摘はもうその通りだ。
ありがとうございます。
他にいかがでしょうか。どうぞ。
プレゼンすみません。はい。プレゼンテーションありがとうございました。すみません。私の知識不足なのかもしれないんですけれども、こちらのクワイエットアクティビズムっていうのは日本でどれくらい広まっているもので、世界的な動向だったりとかっていうのがなんとなく分かったらいいなと思ったんですけれども、いかがでしょうか。
皆さんもやられてますよね、大きいよね。そういう意味では。ああいうものも全部含めて、そういう、いわゆる企業と対話をして、で、何かを変えようっていうスタイルなので、だんだんこの手の分析が難しくなっていて、この、特にガバナンス・フォーナーズさんがやられた時期っていうのは、まだそういうふうに、エンゲージメントっていうもの自体が2007年とかスタートしてるので、そんなに、まあ、もちろんブラックロックさんはもっと早い時期にかなり始められてるんですけど、そういう意味では、比較的早い時期になる。ただ今だと、それこそいろんなファンドさんもやってくるし、実際に企業の IR の人とか聞いてみると何社今年あったかなみたいな世界になっているので、果たしてどの一つが果たしてインパクトがあったのかっていうことを、アイデンティファイするのがだんだん難しくなってるなっていうふうに思う。ですから、まあ、あんまりいい答えになっているかどうかわかりませんけど、そういう意味では、どんどん増えてるっていうのが私の直感的な印象です。なので、まあ、2010年ぐらいまではすごく少なかったんだと思うんですよね。ただ今だとそんなに珍しい話で。
はい。よろしいでしょうか。それでは、鈴木さんの報告はここまでといたしましてですね、次に、マルコ氏のですね、ご報告に、移らせていただきます。QA で、皆さん、ズームで参加されている方、ご質問があればですね、残していただければですね、パート2のところで、またですね、立ち返って、議論をいたします。その時にですね、ピックアップして、質問にお答えできる機会が持てればと思っておりますので、遠慮なくですね、質問を残してください。それでは、マルコ先生、報告、準備できましたら進めようと。よろしいですか。Are you okay? Okay, please.
Right. So, as Julian Franks said, it's a great pleasure to be in Japan and to have the honor to address you. So, the purpose or the scope of my talk is to brief you on the latest developments regarding control enhancing mechanisms in Europe and to provide you with some of the reasons, or with actually two reasons, why these have become more prevalent in the last few years in Europe. And then I will also make the link with the topic of today, which is the new capitalism in Japan. I'll call it responsible capitalism, and how that relates to control enhancing mechanisms. So the two types of So if you could advance the slide by one. Yes, great. Okay, so the first part of the talk about control enhancing mechanisms in Europe is going to be about two forms that have become more popular these days. One is dual class shares, they don't need much introduction. And the other one is called tenure voting. That I think is less known, so I'll go over dual class very quickly and then speak a bit more about tenure voting. And then in the second part, I'll relate responsible capitalism to control enhancing mechanisms. And I'll first define what I mean by responsible capitalism, give you some examples, and then relate that to the market for corporate control that Julian, Franks, and Ike have already talked about. So let's go to control enhancing mechanisms. So just as a reminder, okay, so just as a reminder, this is the this is a chart that shows you the way in which voting power stems from ownership when you have a dual class share system. So if you have one share, one vote, you obviously get 50%. Then if you have 2 to 1, a 2 to 1 ratio, then you can get 50% of the votes with 1/3 of the ownership. And if you have a 10 to 1 relationship, you only need 9% of the ownership to get 50% of the voting rights. And then if you go to 20 to 1, which is not uncommon in the United States, you then have 5%. You can only need 4%, 4.8% of the ownership to get to 50% of the voting power. Now, why is this relevant in Europe? Why are people talking about it today? It's because of the United States and because a lot of IPO companies in the United States today, as you know, use dual class. This wasn't the case because it was not really used in the US before 1980. The New York Stock Exchange would not list you if you had dual class. But today, as you can see from this clip from the Financial Times, it is a prevalent method for going to the market in the US. Now, politicians in Europe look, and stock exchanges and others, look at how many companies are listing in Europe. And there is this figure which comes from a recent report by Auxera, the consultancy prepared for the European Commission, that shows you net listings on European markets. And you can see that there are two extremes. So first of all, on the left, you have Sweden and Poland that have a net gain to the stock exchange from IPOs. So IPOs are more prevalent than delistings. And as you know, Sweden is the case par excellence of dual class shares in Europe. If you look on the other hand, you have the UK and you have Germany that are losing companies from the stock exchange. And you will not be surprised that there has been some soul searching in London, and Lord Hill had a review of whether dual class shares should be allowable, or listings by dual class should be allowable in the UK. And we can talk about this on a separate seminar, but basically there's a compromise between institutional investors not wanting this and people who think this will promote IPOs. And it is a sort of like dual class, but not really dual class, because you have to have a sunset clause, so which kind of deprives the spirit of dual class. So you can get the leverage, but then it disappears, which is not really dual class. Germany announced this year that there's the same concern, and Germany is thinking about introducing dual class. By introducing, I mean putting it on the books. Germany went away from dual class, banned dual class, and imposed one share, one vote. So under German corporate law, you can actually not get dual class at the moment. So this is putting dual class back on the books in Germany. And then, of course, the question will be, will people use dual class or not? If you look at the recent Porsche IPO, they went to the market with non-voting shares. If dual class had been available, it is not unlikely that the Porsche family would have chosen dual class instead of non-voting shares. So that's the first reason, or the main reason why people talk about dual class in Europe today. It's to promote IPOs as induced by the US experience. Now, talking about Japan, I think, that would be the same kind of question. The second phenomenon is tenure voting. Now, tenure voting comes from France. In France, you get multiple voting rights, not through issuing two different classes of shares, but by modifying your statutes. So if you hold your shares for more than 2 years, or more than 4 years, or in this case, Pernod Ricard, more than 10 years, you get twice the voting rights. It doesn't have to be twice. You can also get it 4, 10, 20 times. You can choose. Now, why is this important? Because it's one single class of shares. So, for example, if index providers ban dual class, you're not affected by this because it's one single class of shares, and it's very democratic in principle because everybody can, in principle, get these shares and can avail themselves of the dual voting rights. The motivation for this is benefiting long-term shareholders. So the rhetoric is short-termism versus long-termism, and it gives more voting power to long-term holders. And that's really the political motivation behind this. And you can see this comes out of a directive about long-term, and tenure voting has now been put on the books in Belgium, in Italy, and in Spain. And it's always been available in the Netherlands. And I'll show you an example how you can move to the Netherlands to avail yourself of this type of structure. So what does that look like in terms of the chart I showed you before? Well, initially, it looks very much the same. So 1 share, 1 vote, 50 ownership, 50 votes. If you have 2 to 1, so you double the votes after a certain holding period, you can get 50% of the voting rights with 33. You can get 50% with 9% if it's 10 to 1, and it's 4.9% with 1 to 20. Now, however, note the chart doesn't look the same as before. Why does it not look the same? This is the voting leverage you get if you are the only person holding for the period. So you're the only person that gets the multiple voting rights. Now, by definition, other people can also hold for a longer period. And if they do that, they also get the multiple voting rights. So if everybody does this, so everybody holds then more than 10 more years, then the effect goes away, which is why the curve is sloping down. So how much your leverage is depends on what everybody else is doing. So that's one key difference between dual class and loyal tenure voting, or sometimes referred to as loyalty shares with tenure voting. The other thing is, and that's interesting, that the number of votes changes every day because it depends on how many people get the voting rights. So actually, if you're a tenure voting company, you have to publish the number of votes at regular intervals because otherwise people don't even know how much voting power they have because it depends on the total number of votes, which depends on what other people do. Okay, so that's already a complication. Now, what does that then look like when you look at the structure of a typical share register? This is again Pernod Ricard, which is, by the way, and they sell, as you know, they sell high spirit drinks. So if you look at the first block holder, that's the family. So the family gains from this structure. It goes from about 15% to 21%. So that's the voting leverage I was talking about. The employees gain and the directors of the company, management of the companies gain. Now, if you look now to institutional investors, the capital group actually goes down in their voting rights because in this term, if somebody goes up, somebody has to go down. So they go from 10% with ownership to actually 8.4% of the voting rights. And here comes BlackRock. So in case you were wondering what your colleagues in France are doing, so they go from 5% to 3.8%. And by the way, we also have Elliott there, so who Ike mentioned. They also go from 0.6 to 0.5%, so their voting power is also reduced. Now you should ask, why is BlackRock reducing, why is their voting right reduced? Presumably they're a long-term index fund and they should actually get the multiple voting rights as well. So why are they not getting the multiple voting rights? Well, in order to prove that you are a shareholder in France and in Italy and in Belgium, you have to register your shares with the company. You have to block them, and they can't do that. Only the family can do that. Only the management can do that. So de facto, the institutional investors can't get the multiple voting rights, which actually makes this a kind of dual class that benefits families. Does it have to be that way? No, it does not have to be that way. With technology, you could also give the BlackRocks or the GPIFs of the world these multiple voting rights. But of course, that's not what the families want, because the families want to have the dual class. So they don't actually want the institutional investors who hold for a long period to have these voting rights. Now, in case you were wondering what's Elliott doing there, they actually engaged with Pernod Ricard because they thought the performance was not good enough. And actually, although they only had 0.6% of the ownership and their voting power was reduced by the loyalty shares, they still managed to get their agenda through, and Pernod Ricard settled with them. And this was all about performance. It was about higher share price. It was about a bigger premium. It was about more efficient management. It was about selling more alcohol, and Elliott got their way. Now, was the family unhappy with this? Probably not. If you want to shield yourself completely from the Elliots of the world, is 20% enough? No, it's not enough. Now, in case you were wondering what other families are doing, here's the example of Campari. That's an Italian drinks company. They had 2 to 1. That wasn't enough. So the controlling shareholder decided to move to the Netherlands and to adopt a Dutch system by which you can actually get 10 to 1 in the Netherlands over a 10-year holding period. And then he has more than 50% of the ownership. So if nobody else holds more than 10%, more than 10 years at the end of this, his voting power is going to go over 90%, okay, from 50 to over 90%. So that is really, you can either sell down, but you know, if Elliott come to Campari and wants something, they will say, thank you very much for the visit. It was nice listening to you. Elliott probably wouldn't engage with. Okay, so that's the first part, why 10-year voting is popular, long-term, short-term. Now, that's, however, not the only thing. Why did Campari do this? Why did Campari choose 10-year voting over dual class in the Netherlands? And I actually heard the chair of Campari speak in Milan, and he gave the reason. The reason is, if you want to adopt this, it's much easier than adopting dual class, because if you want to adopt dual class, you have to do the takeover of the company and then issue new shares as dual class. 10-year voting, it's a statute modification. So with 66% in the case of Italy, you can introduce it. So if you want to introduce the CEM, 10-year voting is much better. So that's something to be kept in mind if you want to introduce this. Now, let me turn to the second part of my argument, which is the second powerful argument that you can have for introducing CEMs now. But it's also a powerful argument against CEMs. Okay, but let me first give you the argument in favor of CEMs, and that is responsible capitalism and its link with the market for corporate control. And the thesis I'm proposing is that responsible corporate behavior does not immediately translate into financial performance, is subject to control challenges through the market for corporate control, the first market that Julian Franks was talking about. So, and Professor Suzuki, so hedge fund activism or takeovers. So, but before I can make that argument, I actually have to define responsible capitalism. And the way I would like to do this is by actually defining what might be irresponsible capitalism. And of course, as René Stulz pointed out to me, capitalism can't be irresponsible. So it's actually about what is irresponsible behavior. And I would like to give you first Oliver Williamson, Nobel Prize winner, he called this opportunism. He defined that as pursuit of self-interest with guile. Now, if that is too fancy a phrase, let me give you something more precise. Irresponsible capitalism means economic actors selling goods and services that cause harm for people or the planet in the pursuit of profit or power. Okay? Now, Japan, of course, is a country of great responsibility. Everybody wears a mask, although you don't get thrown in prison if you do not. I think this should actually speak to Japan, at least in personal behavior. Now, the other question, however, is when does behavior become irresponsible? When does it become irresponsible not to wear your mask? It becomes irresponsible when you know that not wearing your mask causes harm to other people. If you don't know, you can debate whether that is irresponsible or not. So let me give you an example from the most valuable drinks brand in the world, Coca-Cola. Their purpose statement, their purpose is refresh the world, and the biggest value brand is right in the middle, Coca-Cola. Now, if you have the chance of not the water bottle, but looking at the back of a Coca-Cola bottle, you will now actually find the nutritional value of Coca-Cola, and you will find that actually most of it is sugar. In fact, if you have one Coca-Cola bottle and you drink it, you will be consuming 130% of your daily recommended sugar intake. Is that good for your health? I could now cite a pile of studies that show you that it is not good for your health. Does the Coca-Cola board know this? Presumably. Is it responsible to sell a drink that contains 130% of your daily sugar intake? Probably not. Is it profitable to do that? Oh yes, absolutely. Okay. Now, if you're not convinced by sugar, let's turn to plastics. Right? Who is the largest producer of plastic bottles in the world? Coca-Cola. Actually, you can add up there. You have some others, PepsiCo, Unilever, Nestle. You know, there's a nice list there of very responsible companies that are in the top 10. Coca-Cola produces more than all of these others added together. Okay, so they are the plastic bottle champion of the world. Does the board know this? Yes. Is it responsible to do this? No. Now, we can argue between friends what would happen if Coca-Cola would take the sugar out of all its drinks tomorrow and it would stop selling their drinks in plastic bottles. You just have to walk around Tokyo and you can see this would not be good for their share price. So there is a trade-off between responsible behavior and financial performance. And we can argue in the long run, as Keynes said, we're all dead. We can argue about the long run, but in the short run, there would certainly be a financial cost to be paid. Why does this matter? Let me turn to another company, Unilever, which was already on the list, actually. Now, Unilever, until very recently, had an ironclad takeover protection in this Dutch-UK structure, because in this structure, the board of Unilever was the only entity that was allowed to put forward directors for election to the board. This would be a bit like Donald Trump being the only person to put forward a candidate for election to the US Congress. Okay, or Joe Biden. Okay, let's be politically correct. And that's unfair because a corporation is not a government. Okay, now you can vote, but there's only one candidate. That Elliott can put up candidates, but they can't because only the board can put up a candidate. So that was an ironclad structure, but then because the UK shareholders insisted, now Unilever is a UK PLC that has absolutely no takeover protections. So it is subject to all the pressures of UK shareholders, and that might be actually a great thing. Now, the CEO who came in, Alan Job, said the following to the Financial Times. His motivation for that move was A, to have currency for making acquisitions, but B, he said that he was going to prove incontrovertibly that sustainable business does drive superior financial performance. Okay, so you can have it both. You can not have the sugar in your drink, and you can have superior financial performance. That's essentially what he was saying to the Financial Times. Now then, an action group called Share Action, they filed a shareholder proposal saying that Unilever should actually have better disclosure about the nutritional content of their food. Now, why did they do that? Because if you look at a league table of nutritional content of food, Unilever are, despite all their marketing, pretty much at the bottom. There are also some Japanese companies there, but I'm not going to name their names. Okay? So Unilever was not doing well on this. Why did they not do well on this? Well, because they were actually using their own nutritional scale to score their nutritional performance. But this scale is a scale that's done by an independent institute that values the nutritional performance of their food products. Now, what Unilever then did is they announced that they were actually going to adopt the external scale proposed by Share Action. Now, that was a big win for Share Action, and actually this never came to a vote because they withdrew the shareholder proposal because they had this win with Unilever. Now, you would think this is great, more responsible behavior in terms of food by Unilever, etc., until a bit later, a month later, Nelson Peltz and Tryon come along, and Nelson Peltz actually gets onto the board of Unilever. Now, what came next? You can probably imagine what came next. The chairman, Unilever announced that the CEO, who was incontrovertibly showing that having better standard food and superior financial performance, he was kicked out by Nelson Peltz. Now, we don't know, of course, what Nelson Peltz is going to do in terms of the strategy of Unilever. Is he going to sell less? Is he going to sell healthier products? Or is he going to sell more sugary products? We don't know. Okay? But definitely, if you want to behave more responsibly and it costs you money, the market for corporate control really gets in the way. Now, how can you prevent this? Well, Unilever could have stuck with its old control structure, or it could have had tenure voting, or it could have had dual class shares, because then it would have been immune from this kind of challenge. So that's a powerful argument for takeover defenses and for tenure voting or dual class shares or whatever you want to put in there. So what's the conclusion from this? So it's probably an inconvenient conclusion. So first of all, ESG, yes, it can be very good for it can be doing good by doing well, or doing well by doing good, rather the other way around. Of course, that's possible. But if you like, as Oliver Hart and Luigi Zingales pointed out, or Oliver Hart points out, that's a low-hanging fruit. It's not the interesting or challenging case. More challenging is when it actually costs you money to behave responsibly. Now, in those cases, there is an argument in favor of CEMs. However, if you introduce the CEMs, just because you then can behave more responsibly in terms of this costing money, that then hinders the market for corporate control, preventing irresponsible behavior or poor management or all the other things that we know about that we have lived with when you have corporations that are very well protected from outside influence. Now, it's also true that responsible capitalism provides new business opportunities. Can you have better products than a sugary drink sold in plastic bottles? Surely you can, and that's just one example. Now, however, stopping our addiction to fossil fuels, to sugar, to plastic, and all these things, and fossil fuels I haven't talked about, but that's probably the most important thing because it threatens the future of humanity. Getting rid of that addiction is going to be quite painful, and it's going to do quite a lot of doing. And whether boards can actually do this by themselves, whether boards have the power to behave or the ability to behave responsibly when it costs a lot of money, that is to be seen. But I don't want to finish on a negative note here, but I'd like to show you a picture of my breakfast from last weekend. And as you can see, the traditional way in Japan is that you do not serve sugary breakfast cereals for breakfast. So maybe Japan is actually in a very good place for this new responsible capitalism. Thank you.
マルコ先生、どうもありがとうございました。それでは、残された時間、質疑、応答を移りたいと思いますが、フロアで、質問等ございますか？はい、どうぞ。
Hi, thank you for your presentation. So I'm curious, are tenure voting rights generally transferable, or if they're sold, does that, I guess, clock reset?
Yeah, so it's like a sunset. I mean, there are sunsets where when you transfer the shares, they kick in. So tenure voting is like that. When you sell the shares, you set the clock back to zero. So it's one share, one vote until you've reached the period, the holding period required in order for the multiple voting rights to kick in. The exception typically is family. So the laws typically foresee that when you transfer the shares within the same family, family to be defined by lawyers, could be partners, whatever partners. It depends on how your society defines who kin is. But if you transfer this to partners kin defined by the law, they can keep the holding period that you already have.
I see. And then in terms of the dual class structures, what kind of premiums are typically seen in the differences between those types of classes of voting and, well, super voting and voting?
Well, I mean, there's a whole literature on this. This varies across countries, and across time. You can even have situations where the non-voting shares have a higher price than the less voting class have a higher price than the voting ones, but that could be, for example, driven by liquidity. Scholars often take the wedge between the two, or the difference in the price or the premium for the votes. They take that as a measure for benefits, private benefits of control, but that's a very fuzzy concept. It also depends on the takeover regulation. So it depends on a lot of things. Okay. Who, me?
One question from the audience through Zoom.
杉田さん、声が出せますでしょうか。
もしうまくつながらないようだったら、質問をお聞きして、後で、次のセッションで。はい。はい。わかりました。わかりました。他いかがでしょうか。はい。それで、下村さん。
テニアボーティングに関して質問したいんですけれども、新規の投資家にとっては、その株主の権利が、通常よりも損なわれた形で、投資家として参入することになると思うので、まあ、短期の投資家の権利を損なっているということで言うと、まあ、その株を買う、まあ、インセンティブを損なっているとすると、まあ、流動性っていうのが下がってくるものなのかなっていうふうに思うんですけれども、そういう、まあ、そのテニアボーティングを導入した企業と、 それ以外とで、導入前、導入後で、その株の流動性っていうのはやっぱり変わっているものなんでしょ
う? Well, I can tell you from France, I don't know about the other countries, and there's very little difference. I mean, the number of shares that are being held at the moment is mostly by families, as you could see. So that doesn't really make a difference to the liquidity. The float is still high enough for there to be enough turnover for this not to really impair liquidity. And in any case, tracking is already a reality. So the holding periods have gone up by quite a lot. So a lot of the float is not trading anyway.
他いかがでしょうか。よろしいですか。マルコさんのご報告、前半はいわゆる種類株、種類株と、それから長期に持ってる株式、いろいろな特典作ってやつがロイヤリティシェアなんですけれども、フランスではですね、フランスをはじめとしてですね、一定期間以上持つとですね、議決権が2倍になるというようなですね、仕組みが導入されてて、で、これ自身どういうふうに理解するかっていうのも、事実的には、我々興味を引く問題なんですけれども、この問題、それから後半にですね、ご説明いただきました、こういうようなですね、支配権を引き上げるような仕組みを導入するとですね、一面では長期投資をサポートするわけですけれども、他方ではですね、ファイナンシャルなパフォーマンスが低い時のエクスキューズになるとか、場合によってはですね、イレスポンシブルなね、責任を負わないようなですね、投資行動、企業行動をですね、サポートするような仕組みにもなり得るというですね、不都合な事実をですね、ご指摘いただきました。この点、パート2でもですね、また、再び議論できると思いますので、先ほど質問出していただいた方も含めてですね、なるべく質問をですね、取り上げて議論したいと思いますので、前半はですね、ちょうど予定された時間になりましたので、ここでおしまいにしまして、4時から再開ということにいたしたいと思います。マルコ先生、どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you very much.